The first gigs outside the college was at the Jacaranda, which was a tiny little coffee bar where they played in the cellar. I think they got about 5 shillings each.
The Jacaranda was owned by Alan Williams, a small-time entrepreneur operating on Liverpool's bohemian fringe. His latest enterprise was supplying rock and roll groups to a club in Hamburg. When no other act was available, Williams proposed the Beatles.
The group that was playing there was one of the big groups in Liverpool, which was Derry and the Seniors, featuring Howie Casey, the lead. And he sent me a letter over saying, look, Alan, we've got a good thing going over here for all the Liverpool groups. But if you send that bum group, the Beatles, over to Hamburg, you're going to louse it all up. For God's sake, don't send them. Now, the Beatles were going through one of their drummerless periods. They had been playing at the Cash Bar Club run by Mrs. Best, whose son was Pete Best, who played drums. And so they introduced me to Pete, and I said, okay, play me a drum roll, let's see how good you are. And he played, not too cleverly, but passable. And I said, okay, that's good enough. Now let's go to Hamburg. Hamburg was the Las Vegas of Europe. It was exciting, it was full of life. They had a license to do everything.
To Englishmen of Alan Williams' generation, Hamburg was notorious for its legendary cabaret district, the Reeperbahn, which featured bizarre sex displays, open prostitution, and women wrestling in mud. The music was the least of the attractions. One of the first musicians to go to Germany was Tony Sheridan, a former regular on the British TV show Oh Boy. In Hamburg, he quickly became a local star and a permanent fixture on the Reeperbahn.
Before we came, there was sort of a watered-down German version of rock and roll, which was, say, for example, Teddy Bear, the Presley song, done by a German artist who would wiggle his legs as much as possible and sing a very silly German lyric. The show was sort of the main thing. They wanted a little show, and they would say, mach schau, you know, like inciting you to jump around and smash things.
Alan Williams had booked the Beatles into 2 dreary clubs, the Kaiserkeller and the Indra, where for the next 2 months they played a back-breaking schedule of up to 7 hours a night. The living accommodations provided by the club owner were a far cry from their tidy Liverpool homes.
When they played here at the Indra and the Kaiserkeller, they were living in a room with no window in, and 4 guys of them. The condition they had was terrible in that time.
Horst Fascher, a former boxer who had been banned from the ring for killing a sailor in a street fight, became friend and protector to the Liverpool groups.
I remember that Tony went to him and said, listen, but if you need some protection here, and if you're in trouble with some girls who are prostitutes, and maybe you don't know that they are prostitutes, and you get involved with them, and the pimps find out that you can have a lot of trouble. Talk to Horst about it, and he takes care about you. And then it came that I was more or less their, like bodyguard, more or less.
Although Stewart, their oldest member, had only just turned 20, the Beatles, having grown up in a seaport town, were far from naive. Yet their eyes were opened by the abundance of sex, drugs, and drink that Hamburg offered. The rough life and the long hours far from home hardened them, and their music. The band got tighter, and their repertoire expanded. They were no longer that bum group that nobody wanted. They were professionals.
The 7 hours a night thing, the practice, and having to enlarge the repertoire as far as possible, that really made you either good if you had what it took to be good, or you gave up pretty soon.
With playing 7 hours a night for 2 months, the experience you gain for yourself is tremendous. You learn how to relax your voice, how to utilize your voice, how to improve on the guitar. I think everybody who went to Hamburg came back vastly improved in their ideas, in the technique, and also in the writing capabilities.
In the evolution of things, especially music, there are certain centers and there are places which serve as a sort of a breeding ground, and people played the roles of catalysts, and Hamburg was one of those.
Bill Harry had shared a flat with John and Stu in the art college days. While they were in Hamburg, he was at home, rapidly becoming an expert on the growing Liverpool beat scene. He would soon start a newspaper called Merseybeat to keep track of all the new groups and new clubs.
They came back from Hamburg still as an unknown band. I started promoting them as the sort of big band. Though they weren't really the big band in Liverpool, I sort of promoted them like that because they were close friends of mine. And a promoter, Brian Kelly, had realised their talent, and he'd booked them on all his jive highs, which were the big gigs at the time, Aintree Institute and Litherland Town Hall.
The curtains opened at Litherland Town Hall, and there was just these guys on the stage. At the time, everybody was into uniformity, wearing the same clothes. And these guys with hair longer than what I'd ever seen in my life. And I think sort of jeans and leather jackets just anyway, smoking cigarettes, you know, just up there doing it and having a ball.
The moment the Beatles struck up and did their stomping, everybody, every kid froze, and then they all run to the stage and started screaming.
Following their debut at Litherland Town Hall, the Beatles became sought after by small dance hall owners throughout Liverpool. Bob Wooler, a postal clerk with an encyclopedic knowledge of all the Liverpool bands, had recently become a part-time DJ at the Cavern, the local jazz club. When he began booking groups for the club's lunchtime sessions, among them were the Beatles.
Hi there, all you cave dwellers. This is Bob Wooler saying welcome to the best of sellers. We got the hi-fi high and the lights down low, so here we go.
Converted to rock and roll with the Beatles as one of its regular bands. As in Hamburg, they continued to practice and to learn new songs.
I dug out of my old records a record by Chen Romero called Hippie Hippie Shake, and I played it. It's a long time since I played that record at a jive hall, and Paul had heard this record. He said, who's that? I understood why he liked it, because it suited his vocal range, you see, and his pitching in a strident manner, falsetto style. So he said, lend me that record. And sure enough, they learned the record.
John and Paul had written at least 100 songs together since they met in 1956, but they hadn't recorded any, original or otherwise. Not until they went to Hamburg again in 1960 did they make their first record, and then only as a backup group for their friend Tony Sheridan. The result? An awkward rock and roll arrangement of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. It was intended only for German release.
I used to do that because Gene Vincent did a nice version of it. Gene Vincent did it because he heard Ray Charles doing it. By the time we did it, it sounded nothing like the Ray Charles version, of course. But all the Germans learned that at school, so it was a question of doing something that they'd already heard of.
More significant than that first record was Stu Sutcliffe's decision to remain in Germany to paint and to be with his German fiancée, Astrid. When the Beatles returned to Liverpool and the Cavern, Paul was playing bass. By the fall of 1961, the Beatles were local stars in Liverpool and Hamburg. But playing the Cavern and the German clubs had become routine and a dead end. They seemed to have progressed as far as any group could, outside the musical mecca of London.
Since the scene was so controlled by the London moguls, who didn't want to know anybody from the provinces, people believed, and the Beatles believed, and all the Liverpool groups believed, that they enjoyed the music, they played the music, they'd make a few bob, and that was that.
And it was only, I think, when Brian Epstein actually came on the scene and was telling us how much money can be made, that we could actually make a record. Because none of us ever anticipated making records.
I hadn't had anything to do with pop management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing. And this was quite a new world, really, for me.
Brian Epstein wasn't much of a rock and roll fan. His own leanings were towards theatre and light classical music. But as manager of the record department in his father's furniture store, he followed pop music as a business necessity. Had there not been several requests for the Sheridan Beatles' My Bonnie, Brian never would have visited a place like the Cavern.
I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humour, actually, on stage. And even afterwards, when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm. And it was there that really it all started.
Though he knew nothing about managing a group, Brian convinced the Beatles that he had the connections to make them famous.
His family had money and owned record shops. And the fact that he would have some pull in the music industry suddenly began to make people realise that he could maybe have some influence in getting them to become a national name.
Before Brian could get them their national name, he'd have to make a few changes.
When Brian took them over, he had plastic-type photographs, he had them all done in the suits. He really smoothed out their image. John would give me all photographs of them taken in Hamburg, pictures of him on stage with the toilet seat round his neck, or pictures of him reading the newspaper in his underpants in the Reaper barn. And as soon as Brian took them over, John came rushing round to me asking for all these pictures back because Brian wouldn't allow that sort of image with his boys.
In spite of Brian's efforts, the Beatles' horizon seemed hopelessly narrow. A third trip to Hamburg only darkened their somber mood. Stuart Sutcliffe had been suffering from severe headaches ever since the group had been jumped by a gang of toughs 2 years earlier in Liverpool. The day before they arrived, Stuart had died of a brain hemorrhage. Stunned by the death of Stuart and bored with playing the same old clubs, the Beatles needed some good news.
Brian Epstein walked into my office one day and said he got a group that he wanted me to hear. Brian had apparently taken one of his tapes into the EMI store in Oxford Street to get it transferred to disc. And the engineer heard it and thought it was very good. Brian told him how he'd been to every record company in the country and hadn't gotten anywhere with it. And he saw me because I had a reputation at that time for being rather screwball and rebellious, and I would take any nutty thing like the Beatles.
George Martin was as unlikely a producer for a rock and roll group as Brian Epstein was a manager. Although trained as a classical musician, he'd been producing eccentric comedy records at Parlophone, a specialty label owned by EMI. Ever on the alert for new ideas, Martin was intrigued by the demo Brian played.
The music wasn't frightfully original. There were no great songs there. It was just the sound was interesting. I arranged a recording test of them in Abbey Road, No. 3 studio.